In this video, I'm going to be covering everything to do with squid fishing, from gear to squid jigs, locations, and just general tips and tricks. If you're getting started squid fishing, then this video is for you. First of all, we'll go through gear. Gear is fairly important when you're squid fishing because you want a nice all-round combo, which is good for casting jigs, retrieving jigs, and then ultimately fighting the squid when you've hooked up to one. So I'm going to go through my personal combo which I use, and it's a really good all-rounder for fishing off the piers, boats, or a kayak, which I do a lot of as well. First of all, I'm going to cover rods, because rods are probably one of the most important things when you are squid fishing. So what I'm looking for in a rod is ideally roughly 7 foot in length. I like that 7 foot length because it's really good for all round. You can fish the boats, you can fish piers. I do a lot of kayak fishing, so it's a great length for all of them. But if you are going to strictly fish land-based, I would go with a slightly longer rod. There are some purpose-built eggy rods, so if you are purely a land-based angler, I would look into a slightly longer rod. But for me, I like that 7 foot length for being able to fish boats, kayaks, piers. You can do it all with a 7 foot all-round length. Now, rod weight is very important as well, and when I'm squid fishing, I like that 2 to 4 kilo size class. So that means it has a fairly flexible tip, so when you're fighting those bigger squid, it can absorb those big pulls. So rod 2 to 4 kilo, 7 foot range, or slightly longer if you're purely a land-based angler. That's what I'll be looking for. We've got our rod, now we need a reel to go along with it. So with the 7 foot, 2 to 4 kilo rod, which I've picked out, I've actually paired up with that a 2500 size reel. So you can see that that's really nicely balanced, which helps for casting and retrieving the squid jigs. Now, I'm going to be honest, reels probably aren't as important as rods, but one thing which you really do want is a nice smooth drag. When that squid's pulling backwards, because they do big lunges backwards, you need a nice smooth drag to help absorb that. Especially when you get a bigger squid, they'll pull a fair bit of line out of that reel. When you get a small squid, the rod will do a lot of the work, but when you start getting into those bigger squid, you want that nice smooth drag to help you out. So 2500 size reel and smooth drag. Now that we've got our perfect little rod and reel combo, we're going to move over to line, because line is also very, very important, and there's going to be two main ones which we cover: braid and also fluorocarbon leader. Before we move on to braids, if you are curious on my exact combo rod, reel, line and leader, I'll actually list it in the description below, so you can check it out there, see exactly what I'm using, and maybe get it yourselves. Braid. Braid is very, very important and takes up the majority of the spool. The reason we choose braid is because it is super, super thin. This helps with casting distance. You can also stay connected to your lure much, much better. So when it's sinking down the water column, it makes it much easier to work. And you can also sometimes feel when the squid grab your lure. You can't do that with any other line apart from braid. So braid is massively important when you're doing any type of lure fishing, including squid fishing. I would recommend 12 to about 20 pound. On this combo in particular, I'm running 20 pound braid, and that is because in the areas I fish, there is a whole heap of thick kelp beds, thick weed beds. If you use light braid, you will just pop off jigs all day. The last thing you want to do is spend $80 on jigs and lose them all in 4 casts, because you will get snagged when you're squid fishing. So I recommend a heavier braid, especially if you're getting started, just so you can get your jigs back. There is one massive downside with using braid though. It's super thin, it casts really well, but it is also incredibly visible in the water. That's a massive problem when you're chasing squid, because these buggers have huge eyes. They're visual predators, so if they can see the braid, sometimes it will spook them. So what we do to combat this is use a leader. This is the one which I use personally, Platypus Hard Armor Fluorocarbon leader in 20 pound. So what I'll do is I'll get 2 rod lengths worth of this stuff, and I'll pair it up with the braid. So I'll have 20 pound braid going onto the 20 pound fluorocarbon leader. It's also really beneficial using that slightly longer fluorocarbon leader, because if you do get snagged, you can pull it directly from the leader instead of the braid. So if the jig's snagged underwater, you can go right up to it, pull it from the fluorocarbon, and you'll have less chance of breaking off again. So fluorocarbon is pretty much a must-have when you're squid fishing as well. And that pretty much covers the combos and the lines. So now we're moving on to a very topical discussion, squid jigs. I'm going to go over squid jigs, what I think of them, and what I'd recommend if you're getting started. Squid jigs are the purpose-built lures for chasing squid. Now you can get very, very technical with squid jigs, and there are thousands of different colors and shapes and sizes, and there's a lot out there on the market, but I'm going to keep it very, very basic and just give you a few pointers on what to look for if you're going into a tackle store and picking out some jigs. Easily the most important thing when you're selecting squid jigs is the size of jig. Now this will vary depending on where you are and how big the squid are in your area. Where I fish, the squid are fairly large on average, so I pick out the size 3.5 jigs. But if you're in an area where you know the squid are much smaller, you can downsize and select the 2.5s, 1.8s, 3 size jigs, so you can catch those smaller squid. Now what I would be doing if I was walking into a tackle store and didn't know how big the squid were in my area is actually pick up a couple of different sizes. So I might get 2 3.5s, 1 size 3 and 1 2.5. So I'd usually start off with a bigger jig because you can cast further, cover more water. But if you get a pack of little squid which follow in the big jig but won't commit, you can just switch over to the 2.5, and more times than not they'll easily go up to it, commit to it much more than that larger jig. So if I was going into a tackle store, pick out a little bit of a range in size just to cover you for all bases. Squid jig colors, a very topical discussion, and I'm going to be honest, I really don't think it matters too much. You could go to a pier and ask 20 different people what their favorites are, and they might give you 20 different results. It's all about whatever you have confidence in. So I'm going to show you my 4 confidence lures and the ones which I would be looking for on the shelves if I was snooping through a tackle store. So number 1 is a classic. I've caught more squid on this jig than any other, the full white. That is an all-time classic. Moving on to the next one is a red belly foil jig. So it's got a red belly and a bit of a darker top. The next one is actually like a rainbow color. I don't know why, but in the past, and I always end up going to a rainbow color if I'm struggling. And then the final one is a little bit out there, but it's like a highlighter. It's got a mix of the green and yellows and the oranges, but this jig does really well as well. So they're the 4 ones which I have confidence in, and hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea if you're checking out the shelves and want to get a squid jig. So they're my 4 favorites. Now we're going to run through techniques and areas where to look for squid. Locations. So locations are obviously important because you want to be fishing where the squid are. So there's a few things which I like to try and tick off when I'm looking for a spot to go squid fishing. The first thing is some deep water. So more than 2 meters, less than 2 gets a little bit hard to work jigs. So anywhere where there's some fairly deep water close by. The next thing is weed beds. Weed patches and weed beds are probably the most important thing when you're looking for a spot to go squid fishing, because they hide in the weed, they spawn in the weed. Everything to do with squid involves weed. So it's another important thing. The last thing is probably structure. So if you're fishing off a pier, that's the structure. If you're fishing off a boat or a kayak, the drop-offs are the structure. So looking for some structure is also very important as well. And another one is clear water. If you can find clear water in a spot, that makes a massive difference. The squid do not like dirty water. In these areas where I fish, if the water's dirty, I won't even try because I know how hard it's going to be. So clear water is another massive thing, and that goes back to squid being visual hunters as well. Just that visual presence is massive when you're squid fishing. So I guess if those 4 key things all line up in an area which you've chosen, you're in for a very good shot to find squid. Lastly, we're going to cover techniques. Now the technique to squid fishing is different to pretty much anything else. It's very different to lure fishing, soft plastics fishing, very, very different. So I'm going to show you it now. So we've got down to our location, spot which we've chosen, and the first thing which I've noticed is we have a fair bit of wind. So the wind's pumping in from this way, so I want to use that wind to get extra casting distance on my cast. So I'm going to do that, put a big cast out here, bang. I know that there's weed patches here and a big weed bed here from the past, so I've just cast that out. I also know it's really shallow here, so I'm not going to let it sink for long, but this is the most important thing, the technique. Big whips. So big whips, and you can also hear that drag clicking over as well. So I'm running a fairly loose drag, don't want it too tight in case we do hook a squid. But when we whip it, that jig is darting up through the water column looking like a little prawn, a little fleeing bait fish. And that's what the squid love. The squid love that erratic movement. Also goes back to them having big eyes and just seeing that fish darting away. Something moving really quickly just seems to catch their eye. So a few big whips, let it sink back down, they'll always grab it on the sink. That's another massive key, massive factor. If you're fishing the deeper water, you have to let it sink down near the bottom. Probably 95% of the time, the squid will attack it while it's sinking. So a sink is very, very important. A few flicks, we'll just finish that retrieve, wind that in, let's go for another cast. You'll notice on this one, I'm gonna go in a completely different area. That one was out there. This one I'm gonna do pretty much directly in front. Now, the reason you do this is because squid are gonna be hovering over that patch of weed. And if you do the same cast every time, you're just covering that same bit of weed. You wanna work the entire weed bed. So if you're on a pier, you do one cast out and then take one step, have another cast, wind that one in, have another cast, slowly work your way along the pier and cover the weed bed. If you're on a boat or a kayak, you're just drifting along the weed bed, so you're covering ground anyway, but you wanna make sure that you're not just fishing the one spot. You wanna be proactive, hit a whole bunch of different areas and hopefully find squid. They're a bit of a schooling creature as well, so you could cover a massive area, not get anything, find this one little patch where they are, and you get 5, 6, 7 squid in that one little area. So when you do get one as well, put another cast straight back in and keep hitting that area, because more than likely there's going to be more there. Wind that in again. We'll do our third and final cast in a different area once again, just directly out there. And this time I'm going to give you another tip, which is the sink rate of jigs. So pretty much every meter of water you're fishing, you want to let that jig sink about 3.5 seconds, maybe 4 seconds. So I've let that sink down. It's only fairly shallow here, about 2 meters. Let that sink for 6-ish seconds and then start the retrieve. So whip, 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 and let that sink back down. On the sink, watching the line very closely, because sometimes you actually can feel the squid grab the jig, and that's when you know you're on. But a few more whips. Very basic retrieve. So if I was doing this properly, I'd next cast, I'd go down there, maybe cast to the left, do a few down on this lower pontoon to the right, and just cover this weed bed really thoroughly. Anyways, everyone, that is going to conclude my beginner's guide to squid fishing. Hopefully you learned something along the way, whether it comes to squid fishing gear or maybe some techniques to catching the squid as well. But if you enjoyed this one and you want to see more how-to videos, give it a like, comment your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.